Well, I'm really happy to greet you all on behalf of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. This is one on the series of the workshops dedicated to Maximus the Confessor. I'm not particularly familiar with his work, but I was discussing with Vlado and to see what to say, actually, why this is relevant for us. And he told me several very interesting things, that Maximus the Confessor was one of two, together with Dionysius Areopagite, the most translated authors from the medieval centuries in Serbia in general. So this is very interesting, and also his thought is seen as inspiring also for discussions which can somehow fill in today's discussions on important social issues. And since Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory is dedicated very much to opening the space for those themes which, let's say, doesn't have another space to be opened, I think this is a really good opportunity. And I'm thankful also to Károli Gáspár University for taking us as a partner. I'm very thankful to Vlado also for leading us through these workshops. And I'm particularly happy that it has its output as this is something which we necessarily have to have now in times of publish and perish, which is actually the series of the books in the Brock series Subsidia Maximiliana, which is edited by Alex, Leonard, and Vladimir. So this is something which I think came out very much from these workshops, which are organized in Károli Gáspár University and in the Institute. So I wish you all productive discussion, and I'm looking forward to reading something about it and enjoy today's work at the Institute. We had some works here, but we took care that they will not interfere your work. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are we'll begin in a few moments. I just have a few practical things to say. Of course, we're thank you for seeing us here. It's a big pleasure to be again in Belgrade for the second time. And the only bit of information I have to add is that we will, as announced, we will try to keep all contributions 20 minutes, and then there will be questions. So everybody if you run out of 20 minutes, it's okay, but after 25 minutes, I will start making signs, and that means that you have less time for questions. And Father Alexander suggested that we may put two papers one after the other and then have a longer time for questions, but it's too late to rearrange everything. So I think next conference we'll do it this way. This time we will go by the project by the program as it is. And it's a big pleasure to pass the word to Bronwyn Neal. I'm seated in a strategically wrong position because I can't see anybody.
You can
I will probably move.
Here.
No, I'll move. Oh, wait a second. So I think that we can profit by the little handicap we have, and already pass the word to Bronwyn Neal and begin a little bit earlier. This way we have more possibilities to ask questions. And I think then let us start today's session. And Bronwyn, to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, marvelous. So thank you to Vladimir for the invitation, and to you all for hosting this event. It's really exciting. I'm sorry I won't be here for most of it, but I'm really honoured to be asked to give this opening lecture on the letters of Maximus the Confessor and his epistolary circle. I've been working on the letters of Maximus and other biographical documents about him since my doctoral thesis, which I started in 1992. So 31 years, I think, this year. So he has held my interest for all that time. He really is an amazing author. And the letters are, as many of you will already know, one of the less known contributions of Maximus, but nevertheless very important. So he was born circa 580. His place of birth is disputed. There's a Syriac life, which says he was born in Syria, and there's another that is Greek and says he was born in Constantinople to a very good family. So these lives are written from opposing points of view, and probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So his letters are important aids to establishing the prosopography of those in Maximus' circle and offer valuable insights into his range of correspondence, as well as to his own activities and the development of his thought. Among his correspondents were court officials, high office holders in the church, such as patriarchs, bishops, and bishops of Rome, and in one case, an unnamed monothelite. Now, who there in that room knows what a monothelite is? I'm just wondering how much. Put your hand up if you know about monotheletism. Okay, excellent. Vladimir, you don't have your hand up. Like you do. Okay. Okay, and I think George does. So monotheletism was the idea that Christ only had one will, and that will was mostly divine, and it subsumed the human part of Christ's his intention, I suppose. So if you believed in only one will, it was very hard to explain that passage in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus says to God the Father, not my will, but yours be done. So Maximus and his fellows, who were mostly monks, but also some bishops of Rome, some people in the court, didn't agree that Jesus only had one will, but the emperor wanted to bring both parts of the Byzantine Empire together under one orthodoxy, and he decided that one orthodoxy that everybody should be able to agree to was that Jesus had only one will. So it's called monotheletism, after the Greek for one and will. And there was a preceding version of this idea which is called monoenergism. And an energy is like an operating activity. It's a bit different from a will. It's the kind of action side of the will. So the will's more about intention, and the monoenergism is about whether Christ had one or more operating activities. So first we had monoenergism coming from the Emperor Heraclius and the Patriarch Sergius, and then we had monotheletism. And Maximus was opposed to both eventually. It took him a while to get there, and you see that progression in his letters. So the reigns of Phocas, of Heraclius and Constans II, all 7th century emperors, were overshadowed by the disputed episcopal elections and civil unrest that followed the controversies between the Chalcedonians. These were a group that had fallen on the side of a dual nature of Christ. So you'll see they're all Christological disputes from the 5th to the 7th centuries. And this was the last one, monotheletism. And it was really a playing out of that division that had happened at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. So although very little evidence has survived from the imperial side of the debate over the wills and operations or activities of Christ, the letters as well as their catenae of witnesses from past fathers and the council acts allow us to reconstruct their views. So that's why the letters are important. We have hardly any sources from the actual monothelite side, except a couple of official documents from the Emperor Heraclius and a condemnation of Maximus and anyone who thought like him. And eventually he was sent into exile and died there in 682. So the 49 letters of Maximus and those of his correspondence and his literary circle, there's about 10 of them, also a major source for the major military and social developments of the 7th century. So it's not just about abstruse theological arguments. It's also about the conflicts that were going on with the Persians and then with the Arab forces led by Muhammad. So this question about orthodoxy really was a question about the security of the Byzantine Empire, because the emperor didn't want to have more than one faction going around, Christians fighting with each other, when they needed a united front against first the Persians and then the Muslims. So in addition, we have several letters to Maximus's 49 letters. We've got these other letters from his epistolary circle, those who shared his views that monoenergism and monotheletism were non-orthodox doctrines. So only the emperor had the right to define orthodoxy, but it didn't stop Maximus arguing the point for many years, actually, about 30 years between when he first put pen to paper and when he was actually killed in 662. So I'm aiming here to give an overview of both Maximus' letters, whether in Greek, the original Greek, or in their Latin translations, and other major protagonists of this controversy who were active around the same time. This overview will show, I hope, how important the letters were for achieving the outcome desired by Maximus and the Diothelites, two-will people, the condemnation of monotheletism at the Ecumenical Council of 681. It will also show how epistolary correspondence could be manipulated to escalate controversy. So the great thing about letters is that anybody can open them on the way. They weren't really able to be treated as private documents because they had to travel long distances by hand, and even if they were sealed, those seals could be broken. So we can't really treat these letters as the authors didn't treat them as private. They knew that they could be read by anybody. So sometimes the really important messages were conveyed verbally by the letter bearer. They weren't necessarily, the main part of the message wasn't always in the letter. It was conveyed verbally by the letter bearer. So sometimes one would suspect in the letters of Maximus, they're waffling on apparently about nothing for pages and pages, and you have to wonder really what the actual message that was being conveyed face-to-face was. The other problem with the letters is the style is really high. So it's sometimes called Atticizing. He was trying to emulate Attic Greek. It indicates that he had a very good education himself, but he also uses a lot of hapax legomena, words that aren't found anywhere else other than Maximus. So if you have ever seen that 20-volume Greek dictionary from earliest Greek to modern Greek by Sophocles, you'll often find hapax legomena by Maximus in there. He's the only person that ever used that word before or since. So it makes them quite hard to read. And added to that, we only have the edition of the Patrologia Graeca 91, because Basil Marquesinus has been working on the manuscript tradition, which is very complicated, for more years than I've been working on Maximus, so more than 30 years. And that edition is nearly finished, but it's not quite out yet in the Corpus Christianorum Series Graeca. So that's going to be a great contribution when that does come out. Meanwhile, we have translations in French by Lachet and Ponsoy, and we have occasional ones translated in English, and Pauline and Alan and I have done one of those, but it would be really good to have the lot translated into English, just for accessibility to whoever wants to read them. So some of the letters don't even appear in the Patrologia Graeca edition, which is actually a very poor edition. It has a lot of mistakes, and there's 5 letters, letters A, B, C, and D, named by Jankowiak and Booth in their updated list of Maximus's works in the Oxford Handbook to Maximus in 2015. And there's also the Greek letter to the monks of Askolonitas, which hasn't yet been edited. So there's a small project for anyone who's interested in the Greek letters of Maximus. It's only in one manuscript too, so it'll be a good one. The separation of Apuscular from letters in the Clavis Patrum Graecorum raises a methodological question. So Vladimir's last and Alex's last conference was about the Apuscular, the little works of Maximus, and many of those are also called letters, either in the texts themselves or in the Clavis Patrum Graecorum. So how do we distinguish these 49 epistolae from the 26 Apuscular? 49 epistolae from the 29 Apuscular. Letter treatises, these little Apuscular are, which are of similar length to letters. They treat theological topics like most of the letters, and they're addressed to a friend or an adversary who is normally named. So to all intents and purposes, they look like letters. And yet they've been kind of divided off. So it's a bit of an issue for me, because at the last conference I submitted an article on 3 Apuscular, and they were all letters. So here I'm suggesting that the problem of distinguishing a letter from a letter treatise is still quite a complicated one. It has been treated at length elsewhere, for example, by Pauline Allen. Allen notes that the constraints on length that normally applied to classical letters, which were normally shorter than tractates, could be ignored at will in late antiquity. So just because it's long doesn't mean that it's a tractate and not a letter. You can have very long letters in late antiquity. She adduces examples from Augustine of Hippo and John Chrysostom in the form of letter treatises on poverty. She notes that the conversational tone, which might reveal a writer's intimate thoughts on the subject, is not always present in tractates. And yet she says it is noteworthy that both Chrysostom and Augustine, among others, chose the letter form for moral disquisitions, which on the one hand resemble a homily and on the other a tractate, confirming the fact that however much the epistolographical genre was manipulated, the letter remained an act of public intimacy. So that's the way I'm treating these letter treatises, as acts of public intimacy. They differed from those, Maximus's letter treatises differed from those of the preachers Augustine and John Chrysostom, in that Maximus' content was highly abstract. It was generally about monoenergism and monotheletism, and intended only for the theologically educated to read. It is thus far from accessible for a general audience. This is evident from the high status of most of his addressees. Apart from bishops and hegumenoi, including Thalassios, Maximus wrote to officials of the imperial court, notably Peter Illustris, who was general of Numidia, and John Cubicularius, or head of the imperial bedchamber. The difference between a letter treatise and a letter is well illustrated by letters 2 and 3, both addressed to John the Cubicularius. The first is more like a letter treatise, and the second more like a letter. The first is a discourse on the love of God, the second a letter of thanks for a letter received from John and the monks of the monastery of St George. The first happens to be a lot longer than the other, but both are addressed by name to John the Cubicularius. The prose of the first one is turgid and reads like a philosophical discourse with scripture interspersed. The second seems to be a more sincere expression of genuine affection for John, and thus allows us to conclude that he enjoyed a close bond of friendship with this high officer of the imperial court. So this is another one of the reasons why Pauline and I thought that the Greek life had a lot of merit, because Maximus obviously had these strong networks with the imperial court, and that would have been hard to achieve if he'd been born of lowly origins in Syria. He also has very good Greek. The ornate style of many of the letters makes them difficult to access, as in a similar way to his works of other genres. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to read Maximus, but it's not just the hapax legomena that make it difficult. It's the constructions of the sentences. So these linguistic barriers have no doubt contributed to making the letters the final frontier for scholarship on Maximus, and it's the unexplored content of the letters of Maximus and his epistolary circle that makes the current conference so important. Some of Maximus' letters, as I mentioned, only survive in a Latin translation, which adds to the difficulty of interpreting them because we don't have the original Greek in most cases. We only have the translation. And they were done by Anastasius Bibliothecaris in the 9th century, and he wasn't terribly good at translating Greek. So you kind of just have to make the best you can of Anastasius's Latin. 3 of these are the Apuscular 10, 12, and 20, which I mentioned before, that Ryan Strickler and I presented in the proceedings of the conference, which are about to come out, aren't they? So we're looking forward to that. So there we argued, Ryan and I, that the 3 Apuscula are community letters directed to the minority of Greek bishops, monks, and civil servants who were prepared to resist imperial policy on certain matters of doctrine. The focus of Apuscula 10 and 12 is the ongoing Monothelite dispute. Apuscula 20 is a letter treatise addressed to Marinus of Cyprus and concerns the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Son, the controversial Filioque cause, which had been added to the Creed in the West in the 6th century and which Maximus tentatively defended against imperial condemnation. These 3 Apuscula and the letter from Maximus to Abbot Thalassisos were translated into Latin together with 6 autobiographical documents about Martin and Maximus in the late 9th century by Anastasius Bibliothecarius. The letter from Maximus to the Abbot Thalassisos gives valuable context to the issuing of one of the most controversial documents of the Monothelite controversy, the Ecthesis. Maximus in this letter commended the behaviour of papal legates at Constantinople for remaining firm against imperial pressure when they were asked to support the Ecthesis, to which Pope John IV was opposed. Although Anastasius' translation is by no means perfect, for the biographical documents it serves as a valuable witness, since it predates any of the Greek manuscripts that survive, albeit in a single Latin codex. Another letter with no Greek attestation is that addressed to the monks of Cagliari, and there is philological evidence in the text that it is a translation, despite the fact that it's addressed to people on an island who spoke mostly Latin. This letter by Anastasius the disciple sheds light on the support that Maximus enjoyed on the island of Cagliari and elsewhere in Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. So the primary value of the Apuscula lies in their theological and philosophical content. The letters supply evidence for historical events, especially those of Maximus' own life. Among the 7 documents that Pauline and I edited and translated for Maximus the Confessor and his companions, documents from exile, was one letter to Anastasius the disciple. This one's quite interesting because our edition of that letter allowed us to move the date of the letter to 658, where it was previously thought to have been in 655. And this came down to the reading, a simple reading of mid-Pentecost for the date that he wrote the letter and not Pentecost. So it was this tiny little 3 letters in Greek that allowed us to date it because of the indiction that it gave. It had to be in 658, not 655. So it sort of sorted out the chronology for us because we knew that he'd had his trial in 655 and what he was describing in this letter really didn't fit with somebody who'd just been to trial in Constantinople. It was obviously some time after that. So it turned out to be 3 years after that. So with the original sense restored, the information conveyed in letter 12 to Anastasius the monk, who was at the time in exile in Perbrus, suddenly made sense. So this is one of the good things about having a proper manuscript edition. Generic expectations should be kept in mind when reading the letters of Maximus and his circle, especially those written from exile. So letters from exile have their own tropes. They contain strong motifs of suffering for the sake of Christ and how your enemies are all agents of the devil, including the emperor, and that you're following in the footsteps of earlier martyrs. So even though he wasn't directly killed by the Roman guards that took him around Georgia, in Lazica, now Georgia, where he died, he described his sufferings as if he was a martyr. But we know from the Narrationes that he was called a confessor rather than a martyr. So he was a confessor of the faith. He died as a result of his exile, but he wasn't directly killed by the imperial agents. So the letters are precious witnesses, not just to the events of Maximus' life, but the larger historical picture of an era of crisis for the Byzantine rule over Africa and the Eastern territories. Both sides of the debate, monothelites and diothelites, interpreted apocalyptic events such as the invasion of the Muslims in North Africa and in Syria as punishments for the opposing party for their lack of orthodoxy. So this was an argument that could be used by both sides. The forced conversion of Jews and Samaritans, together with their wives, slaves, and children, at the order of Heraclius in 632, is decried in an addition to Maximus Letter 8. Not everyone thinks that this is a genuine addition, and not everyone thinks that this forced conversion actually took place, but nevertheless, it is stated, it is added to Letter 8 as if it was historical. Maximus expresses his fear that imperial acts like this might be found to be the clear and unambiguous sign of the end of times. So he's really against the forced baptism of Jews and Samaritans. He thinks that it kind of it dilutes the faith. So then in 649, the Lateran Synod held in Rome brought together many Western and a few Eastern bishops in a show of strength that humiliated the emperor, Constans II. The show trials of Pope Martin in Constantinople in 653 and Maximus in 655 before the Senate of Constantinople can only be understood in the context of the crisis facing Byzantium in the form of Muslim invasions. The trials were designed by the Senate to shift the blame for the general crisis onto their diothelite opponents and to present them as criminals. Some letters exemplify what was going on behind the scenes as Maximus supporters attempted to intercede for him at court. For example, John the Conciliarius, or the Symponos, attempted to broker peace between Maximus and the court by writing a letter to the patrician Troilus, and another maybe to Menas the monk, who reported to the palace. Once Maximus in particular was out of the way, the imperial government could turn its attention to thwarting the influence of the Eastern monks in the West, a process that was aided by the re-establishment of communion between the patriarchates of Constantinople and Rome under Eugenius. So they had fallen out of communion. Pope Martin didn't bother to ask the emperor and the patriarch for permission after he was elected Bishop of Rome, and so they never really recognized him, and then he got taken to Constantinople and also sent into exile in Caucasus, modern Georgia, where he died. So he's also a confessor for the faith around this time. And we have one mention of a letter between the two of them, but it doesn't survive. So that's a little bit frustrating. So it's rarely noted that letters between Rome and Constantinople escalated the crisis. I don't know how many of you have written letters to your dean in the last decade, but, you know, it rarely comes out well, does it? It doesn't really achieve, it very rarely achieves the solutions that we want in an administrative context in universities. Even if you get 50 people to sign it, it only annoys the dean more. So the same sort of thing was going on between the protagonists on Diotheletism, and eventually they just stopped writing to each other. The Eastern and Western bishops stopped writing to each other in the 7th century. So this was really the last spate of exchanges in letter. Pauline and I looked at all the letters from the 7th comparing with the 8th century, and they drop off just like they fell off a cliff. There's hardly any from the 8th century between Rome and Constantinople, but there's quite a few patriarchs that were writing to Rome in the 7th century. There's actually eight patriarchs. So when a patriarch comes into power, for instance, Peter in 654, they're meant to write to all the other bishops in the 5 major churches, including Rome, to announce their election and to give their views on whatever doctrinal controversies are going on. And that's called a synodical letter. And when Peter came in 654, he lasted for 12 years. He caused such a stir with his letter in Rome that the people and the clergy rose up and threw it out of the church. They threw the letter out of the Church of Mary ad Praesepe. The Liber Pontificalis tells us about this. It's not a notoriously reliable source, but it's, you know, this is an interesting detail. It's hard to believe that it would have been made up, what the purpose of that was. So the author of this Liber Pontificalis writes, they would not even let the Pope finish celebrating Mass until the Pontiff himself had promised them that he would permanently reject the synodical letter of Peter. It was found to be, the author says, completely unintelligible, and it went beyond the canons, failing to be explicit about the operations and wills in our Lord Jesus Christ. End of quote. The unanimous and violent rejection of a patriarchal letter was unprecedented in the Church of Rome. So you can see all of this is laying the ground for eventual schism between the Roman and Eastern churches, a schism which is only just starting to be mended now. The Acts of the Lateran Synod, which I mentioned took place in Rome in 649, included a florilegium of letters, so a posy, a selection of flowers that were Greek letters and other patristic sources which supported the Diothelites' claims. And there are Monothelite sources in there too. So that's a really precious resource, this florilegium at the end of the Acts of that synod. As a result of that synod, though, Maximus was arrested, taken to Constantinople, tried, and eventually exiled to go somewhere he died. And Martin followed suit. Martin's letters to Constans II, the emperor, and the following 10 letters to Martin, which are found in the Patrologia, Graeca and Latina, all come from a single Greek manuscript of the Acts of the Lateran Synod. So this was a really important synod for preserving letters. They are a valuable witness to the Roman response at the time of the Lateran Synod. There's a few lost letters, which I'll just mention briefly. So letters which are mentioned in other correspondence or in the course of Maximus's trial, which was written down by somebody who may not have been there, but was pretending that they were. So it's meant to be a verbatim account of the trial. And at that trial, a monk cited a lost letter, which the emperor admitted he had issued, in which the emperor admitted that he had issued the ecthesis, but insisted that Sergius was its sole author. So this is Heraclius saying, well, yes, I actually did compose that. I did issue that document, which banned the talking of wills and operations in 638, but it was really Sergius, the patriarch, who wrote it. So obviously, if this letter had survived, it would have been dynamite, but unfortunately it doesn't. So we don't know even if it was really written, but it's just raised at the trial. And another 2 lost letters are raised there. So there's an accusation against Maximus as proof of his treason, that the general Peter Illustrius, who I mentioned before was general of Numidia, had been ordered by Heraclius to take troops to Egypt to repel the Arabs. And Peter wrote to Maximus to ask if he should go ahead, because Peter had Diothelite leanings and he thought Maximus was a holy man of God and would tell him the right thing to do. And John said that Maximus replied to Peter saying he should do nothing of the sort because God did not approve lending his aid to the Roman Empire during the reign of Heraclius and his kin. So this was a very treasonous thing to say, obviously, and that if John could have produced the letter that Peter wrote or the one that Maximus wrote back, then he would have had some good evidence against Maximus, but actually he couldn't produce either of those letters. So Maximus said, well, you don't really have anything against me there, do you? So he was nevertheless found guilty of treason and exiled to Byzia, which is a fort in Thrace. He was tried again in 662 and moved to Lazica modern Georgia, where he was moved on foot from fort to fort before he died. So let's just wrap up then. The last Christological controversy had been settled at the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680, and the era of exchange of imperial letters with Rome was all but over, although the damage to ecumenical relations was permanent, and Maximus' letter Treatise, the Apusculum 20, laid the ground for the Filioque dispute, which finally caused the Great Schism in the 9th century. The linguistic barriers and problems of dating have no doubt contributed to making the letters the final frontier for scholarship on Maximus. The production and survival of so many letters, 49 from the hand of a single monk, and additional ones by his supporters writing in Latin, was out of the ordinary by the 7th century. The 49 extant letters offer unparalleled insights into Maximus' relationships with the main protagonists of the Monothelite controversy, and also those around him who continued to support his Diothelite cause in Constantinople, in Rome, in Károli and North Africa, even while he was in exile. And as I said before, I think it's the unexplored content of the letters that make the current conference so important. And I really wish you well with your endeavours and presentations for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this magisterial introduction. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, and I will kick it up by asking in the first place, can you tell us more about the details? How did the collection of letters come about? Who is responsible for the first collecting, or what do we know about the earliest stage of this preservation?
Yes, that is a very good question. So I mentioned the collection of the 4 letters translated by Anastasius in the 9th century. And Anastasius says he got hold of the original Greek ones in Constantinople. So that leads us to imagine that people in Constantinople were keeping a record, because Maximus was a state criminal. So probably they did have a big dossier of evidence against him. I mentioned that most of the Monothelite evidence has been destroyed, but some of the letters of the Diothelites were preserved in the Acts of the Lateran Synod, but only the ones that they adduced at the Synod that they read aloud. So that kind of meant it was mostly not Maximus himself, but people that were representing him, and as well as the Bishop Martin. So we don't, no one, as far as we know, put together the 49 in a manuscript. They're scattered throughout, actually, almost 100 Greek manuscripts. So they're not all in one place, and it wasn't until Patrologia Graeca brought those 49 together, and then there's still 5 that didn't appear in that collection. So it has been a bit of a mess, you could say, for the stemma. And Basil Marquesinus is the person that really understands this from the very, from the bottom up, but we're waiting for his stemma and his introduction to the various mini collections before we get a really good answer to your question.
Thank you very much. We have written to Marquesinus, but somehow we didn't get the answer, at least not yet.
No, I know. It's a bit of a touchy subject because it's been going on so long. Yeah.
Yes. More questions?
It's okay. Yeah. Well, how does your understanding and interpretation of Maximus's letters affects your attitude towards veracity of both his lives?
So I mentioned that his letters to the high officers in the imperial court seems to support the narrative of the Greek life. I think both the Syriac and the Greek life have invented the early years, their account of Maximus's early years, because we don't have any other sources apart from those two lives, and they're diametrically opposed to each other. And especially the Greek life looks a lot like the life of Theodore, one of the 10th century Theodores. So it looks like a very standardized Greek life for Maximus's early years, just an account of how virtuous he was as a child, and he didn't like playing with other children. He only liked philosophy, and he didn't want toys. He only wanted the Bible and that sort of thing. So there's really no help there on Maximus's early life. But I find the evidence that he wrote to the Conciliarius, the Symphonos, and to the Cubicularius, and to Peter Illustrius very convincing for Greek origins for Maximus, and that he served as proto-Socrates in the imperial court. He really seems to have very strong networks there. I know Jankowiak and Booth are a little more inclined to support some aspects of the Syriac life, of the travels of Maximus around, and his relationship with Sophronius. It seems to have some really good inside information about his time in North Africa. So I think that's why I said at the beginning that the truth probably lies somewhere in between both of them, and they both have elements of his travels, some truth there, although they disagree with each other. So it's quite hard to sort out, an exact timeline for what Maximus was doing in the 630s. But Jankowiak and Booth have done a really good job in their updated date list. It's just that I don't agree with them so much about Maximus's Syriac origins. And you have to be really careful with that Syriac life, because it's obviously pure diatribe against Maximus. It says that his mother was a prostitute and his father was a Persian merchant that was just kind of passing through. So it casts him in the worst possible light. Does that answer your question? What's your own view, if I may ask?
Well, I incline towards your view.
Oh, excellent.
The Greek one is more close to reality. It's closer to reality.
Yeah. But then there are these quite valuable details from the Syriac one.
But I wonder whether there is space for speculation about his connections with imperial family. It's pure speculation now. I mean, in terms of his origin, because Heraclius' family was very large, and many of them were quite involved in the life of that period. So, but it's still just speculation.
Yeah, that is a rather original suggestion. I mean, one thing that would kind of go against that is him saying God doesn't support Heraclius and his kin. So that kind of sounds like, pardon?
I find it's very personal when he told, what Heraclius told about his attitude towards his marriage. I find it's very personal. It's more than just
it's true. It is very personal, actually. Yeah, well, that's an interesting notion. As you say, there isn't actually any evidence, but there might not be any sufficient to rule it out either.
Yeah.
Thank you.
More questions?
Hello, everyone. Nicolas Vasani from Budapest, but momentarily in Belgrade. Talking about the reconstruction of the life events of Maximus and the Syriac life in particular, there is one interesting point which disturbs the reader of the Syriac life. What is your take on this? I think on the first page, he names himself as Grigori, which is Gregorius in Greek. And somewhere on the third page, he names again himself as Georgi, which is Georgios in Greek.
Yeah.
I'm uncertain as to whether we have to make much of this difference, but it is a discrepancy which is there. you know, you wonder if the Syriac account is realistic, then how is it possible that the author of it was unable to write his own name
right
3 times in the same manner? I mean, this question arises because Sebastian Brock insists that this is apparently an autograph. Okay, as soon as this is a copy, you know, a scribe can make this kind of mistake. However, what is your take on this discrepancy?
Well, look, Sebastian Brock is a Syriac scholar and I'm not, so I'm not going, and I have discussed, you know, the lives with him, and he does more towards the Syriac life, but that's a problem with the life that cannot be resolved. And how could you get your own name wrong? The only thing I might add is the possible attribution of that life to George of Rashina would support the Georgios reading. Yeah, so that's all I have to add there. It is a problem. I wonder, because it has such inside information, I wonder if it isn't someone that was part of Maximus's circle and turned against him, or was turned against him. That's kind of the way it seems to read to me, that he has intimate information, for instance, about Maximus's time in Cyprus, but he is very apocalyptic in the way it talks about, for instance, Sophronius as the spawn of the devil. Is that right? It's very, very anti-Sophronius. So, yeah, I think it's a confection, but why the person who wrote it didn't cover their bases by using the same name twice, I cannot explain. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? If
I have a question, Alex, is it possible? So sorry, I'm just raising my hand, but maybe it's not visible there.
Because
oh yeah.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for very good introduction into letters. I have several questions, but I'll try to first how it works. When you mentioned, you made the distinction between Apuscular and the letters, and well, it's plausible thing because they are letters. But when you go to the most of his corpus are letters. How it works with other kind of great works like Thalassium and Mystagogia, and then when you mentioned that lost letters to Peter Illustrious about the treason and the troops in Africa and everything, it seems that this, at least my very kind of narrow knowledge of historical things, that this letter got very much on weight, because when we are talking a treason, I don't know whether he was treated as a heretic, like opposing to the documents, or it also included this part of treason he's actually plotting. Yeah. And then I'm just well, now reading letters again, and I see, for example, when you mention Syriac life, because he's full of accusation against Maximus that he's an originist. And now I see that more I read Maximus, I think that he's more on the originist position, which was really like kind of course, not for the like a pre-existent souls and so on, but what actually constitute like Origenism in the 7th century. Well, thank you.
Yeah, well, 3 good questions there. So about the difference between the Apuscular and the other much longer volumes like Ad Thalassium and Ad Johannum. there's no question there that those are treatises, right? But the problem with the Apuscular is that they're so short. They look like letters. So it's not that they're addressed to somebody. That's the issue. It's that they're such short works and they're addressed to somebody. So why should we distinguish between letters and Apuscular? Probably we shouldn't, actually, would be my view. I would say,
but Epistle 15 is longer, Apuscular 1 is longer. It's not really...
Yeah, that's true. It's not a hard and fast rule. And maybe if I looked at the content a bit more carefully, you would see that there's more personal information in the ones that are called letters. But I just raised it as a methodological issue because as far as I know, no one's really raised it. So if you look at Jankovic and Booth, you've got under the Apuscular, you've got some of the letters. Yeah, and that's fair enough. It's very hard to distinguish them, but maybe we should be asking ourselves, why did at least the editors of the CPG make that distinction? Is it because of the amount of doctrinal content, maybe? Because, for instance, letters A, B, C, D, and E, they have virtually no doctrinal content. Those ones have, maybe actually there's one that does, the Ad Thalassium. There's one to the Abbot Thalassios. It's just a short letter, though. It's not like the whole big, Ambigua Ad Thalassium. So it doesn't really answer your question very well. There's also the questions and doubts, the questiones et dubia, which are addressed to people by name, the people that have asked him. So that's another way you can define a letter, is it's in the answer to a question. Yeah, and that perhaps might distinguish between the letters and the Apuscular, but I haven't really looked for that. If you have any thoughts about how we can distinguish, I'd be really happy to hear them. Okay, so that's the first part of your question. The second one was he accused of treason? Yes, according to the third judgment, the Sephos he was accused of treason, and certainly that the punishment of having his tongue cut out and his hand cut off so that he couldn't speak against the emperor or write against the emperor. We're not 100% sure that happened to him. We're not 100% sure that it also happened to one of the other Anastasi. But the problem with the Sephos is that it says that it happened to both Anastasi, and that is very unlikely, actually. So I don't know if you know about the church in Sageri, where they recently unearthed bones that are attributed to Maximus, and they also unearthed bones of two Anastasi. Well, they think that they were Anastasi because they were also missing right hands. But the textual evidence for both Anastasi losing their right hands is very, very minimal. So when I was there, I argued that we definitely couldn't say that these were the bones of the two Anastasi. And they said they'd do further investigation into it. But at the time, they wanted to say that, this was all three saints in the one place, which would have been a bit of a bonanza for them. Yeah. And the third thing is the Origenist accusation. I know what you mean. I mean, obviously his views on apocatastasis were very Origenist, for instance, but also similar to Gregory of Nyssa. You've got to ask yourself, what was Origenism in the 7th century? I noticed that you use that phrase. It's probably a bit different to the Origenism of the 6th century when he was condemned, and it's certainly very different from the works of Origen himself as they survive. This speaks to me as somebody that has read and knows their works, right? It is kind of a valid criticism. And I'm not quite sure what the actual question was there. Were you saying, do I think it's an accurate portrayal of characterization of Maximus and Sophronius?
No, I think that it's a right portrayal that it fits actually in this picture of being Origenist. Normally, I think that the anti-Origenist camp was very powerful at the 7th century, and a lot of things which are kind of orthodox couldn't pass as Orthodox, but it was declared Origenists in this end.
Yeah.
Because I'm just reading like a 6th and 7th letters when Maximus actually he's defending something which is very normal thing in like a previous, but in 7th century was treated as Origenism.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, you can see why he got. Sorry,
I'm really sorry. We're running on somebody else's time, so maybe,
okay.
It's just unfair on the others to go on. I'm sure there are plenty of questions we could ask Ron and Neil, and maybe after when we've done with all the papers, we could still go back, stay together, and discuss more. I'd like to give the word to my colleague Nicolas Vasani, or Nicolas Vasani, as he introduces himself. I suggest who has been with our conference all the way through, and who will talk about paranetic aspects of in Maximus Letters. I suggest, Nicolas, that you move there, and then the camera will take you better.
Adelphoi caris humin kai airene ectu patrosemon tu teu. I have a little bit changed the title of my presentation, concentrating more specifically on epistle 20. And the title has also changed a little bit. So now it reads like this: an Evagrian ascetic paraenesis in Maximus the Confessor's epistle 20, question mark. Okay, so that's the topic. In this contribution, I would like to pin down the idiosyncratic character of the Confessor's conception of ascetic aretology, as it is expounded, especially in the comprehensive epistle 20, with reference to the plethora of similar paraenetic patristic sources. It is well known that ascetic aretological and paraenetic themes feature early on in Maximus's life work. Such texts are at least the ascetic life, the chapters on charity, and on the Our Father. But it is perhaps less known that paraenetic aretology and asceticism are a prominent topic also in the epistolae, as we can see in epistles 2, 3, 4, 5, as well as 20, which are addressed more often to secular functionaries than monks, but in either case to people in apparent need of moral instruction or support. In all of these texts, epistolary or not, the confessor evidently endorses a long-standing tradition of Greek language, monastic asceticism, and ethical teaching, which begins at the latest with Athanasius of Alexandria's Life of Saint Anthony, and then continues with several orations of Saint Gregory Nazianzen, then the so-called Macarian homilies, Palladius's Losiac history, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and John Muscus's Spiritual Meadow, etc. But the same monastic tradition also extends to several ascetical Syriac sources, like the very early post-apostolic Acts of Judas Thomas, early 3rd century, then the somewhat later Book of Steps, late 4th century, and Theodoret of Cyrus's religious history, written in Greek, but Syrian in subject matter. But to my perception at least, Evagrius of Pontus, a wanderer of God, stands out in terms of directly influencing Maximus, especially by virtue of his The Monk, Practicos, then the Gnosticos, the Gnostic chapters, the foundations of the monastic life, and the notable chapters on prayer. In what follows then, I will try to go after and interpret the confessor's line of thinking as it advances in the text of Epistle 20, arguing that this early piece of epistolary writing probably wants to mark out a particular moral condition in the career of a monk that is most convenient to be made sense of in terms of the Evagrian distinction between the Practicos and the Gnosticos. Besides, I would also like to hint at possible points where the Evagrian doctrine might intersect with the practical theology emerging from contemporary Syrian monastic sources. So what is the status quaestionis? It seems to me that Epistle 20, whilst it is an engaging piece of pareinetic writing, has not received much of analytical scholarly attention. Polycarp Sherwood, in his ground-laying annotated date list of the works of Maximus, 1952, says the following about the letter. Written during the early African stay, 628-30. This is a purely ascetic letter, written with a view to edification, against Maximus's own inclination at the insistence of a revered superior. Such a state of mind suggests an earlier rather than a later date. Africa is likewise suggested on the supposition that in his flight, Maximus passed through Cyprus and so made his, that is, Marinus's acquaintance. Marinus of Cyprus is the addressee of the letter. End of quote. Now, Christian Boudignon in Maximus le Confesseur et Tirs Constantinopolitains, 2004, looks into letters with a more direct bearing on Maximus's biography. So letter 20 rightly misses the boat, while an impressive amount of other epistles are thoughtfully scrutinized. In the synthesizing Opus Magnum, Crisis of Empire, 2014, letter 20 receives a footnote mention by the learned Phil Booth. These studies, however, were meant to be, from the very outset, parts of historical reconstructions and not analyses of moral theological content. That first happens, I think, to my mind, in Marek Jankowiak's and Phil Booth's new date list of the works of Maximus, 2015. Here we read the following, quotes, Maximus in this letter, written perhaps in 636, acknowledges his many faults that will bring upon him eternal damnation and makes a vow of silence, promising to withdraw from theology lest he suffers a bigger and more just punishment. Although he had earned some praise, he will keep silence to avoid leading others astray by the bad example of his life. But he breaks his vow at the encouragement of a most holy heguman, rich in wisdom, who forced him to write to Marinus in order to make known his virtues. Maximus writes on fear of God, insisting that it need be authentic and not simulated, and inveighs against Sadducees, scribes, and Pharisees, who show divine knowledge in words only, not in deeds, and who preach a theology of the demons. Maximus concludes by comforting Marinus and encouraging him to bear current events with patience. The tone of the letter is polemical, the sting of which seems directed against the institutional church. Maximus is disenchanted and takes a vow of silence, apparently after some of his theological declarations have been condemned. He has accepted this condemnation and promised to cease from writing, end of quote. Now, it does appear to me that part of what has just been cited as an interpretive groundwork for letter 20 is in fact purely hypothetical. To my mind, there is nothing particularly anti-ecclesiastical or anti-hierarchical in the text. The one and only passage that may suggest some sort of concrete remorse or soul searching with respect to past events is where Maximus seems to imply that he has been condemned, as he says that, quotes, I resolved to refrain totally from using divine words that, as it seems to me, are much above me, so that I'm not condemned to a bigger degree and more justly, end of quote. But you know, even this is understandable without necessary reference to some kind of ecclesiastic disgrace suffered by the young Maximus. There is in particular nothing referring to the institutional church in the text. On the contrary, it is common in early monastic writing to begin an edifying discourse by emphasizing in the name of sacred humility one's intellectual incapacity and moral unworthiness of the task, and then this resistance is overridden by monastic authors only for the sake of the equally sacred virtue of obedience, just like this happens in letter 20. If the letter is polemical, as Dr. Jankowiak and Dr. Booth propose, then I am more inclined to see it from the very beginning as the expression of an internal spiritual combat playing out inside Maximus's mind between one part which still considers itself as a practicos and another part which is convinced that it has already reached perfection, that is, which considers itself as a gnosticus ready for public teaching. For indeed, the letter argues as follows. Maximus considers himself unworthy of the task of teaching because he thinks he is not virtuous enough. Yet he undertakes the task of writing, instigated by the virtues of others, and in order to promote the virtuosity of others. Now he wants to open up a Gnostic way of the virtues, which leads through the double moral disposition of the fear of God, phobos tuteu, and good insight, agathei synesis, and this road leads to knowledge, gnosis, and wisdom, sophia. The one saves us from sin, fear of God. The other, good insight, transforms us into understanding moral agents whose ethical acts are not mechanical and who are able to reach ethical perfection. And already at this stage, halfway through the letter, we may perceive Maximus's move from praxis towards gnosis. However, we should not simulate a fear of God by visible signs of attrition, but should attain it by an understanding ethical disposition of the heart. Just like we should not display a knowledge which has not been distilled from that ethical disposition. So the bottom line is that we should polish our knowledge through acts, gnosis via praxis, and vice versa, strengthen our acts through knowledge, praxis via gnosis. In other words, the intellectual virtue of gnosis and sophia should be the outcome of the praxis of ethical virtue. Hence, for a start, and that's like point 6 in the train of thoughts of the letter, we should mortify our flesh, come clean of sin, and carry out the commandments to acquire the evangelical virtues of meekness and humility, fundamental virtues both for Greek as well as Syriac monastic literature of the time. It is on this condition that we acquire knowledge too. So on my interpretation, Maximus emerges here as a monk, hesitating as to whether he should come out and emerge publicly as a teleios, gnosticus, or he should still continue practicing the ascetic virtues in pursuit of perfection. He is in two minds about this, as he is already teaching in this letter himself and Marinus. This reading would fit in with the early dictation of the letter and would make it an example of the confessor's application and appropriation of the Evagrian bipartite system of classifying monks into practicoi and gnosticoi, which as a matter of historical fact runs parallel with the contemporary bipartite system of the Syrian Book of Steps, classifying believers into Zadikei, the true, and Mirei, the perfect. Importantly, even Evagrius dedicates in the Gnosticus a number of kephalaia to the transition or upgrading of a monk from the lower class of the practicoi to the more dignified category of the Gnosticoi. Also, on this interpretive hypothesis, we perceive Maximus actually fighting back the incentive of stepping forward and teaching, while at the same time he very well knows that teaching is an integral part of higher Christian discipleship. Just like the Syrian Book of Steps also teaches the monk, when they have reached a certain stage in the practice of the virtues, is obliged to step forward and embrace the calling to become an itinerant religious teacher whose explicit task it is to teach whoever is ready to listen and to convert them. As we read, for instance, in Homily 19 of the Book of Steps, the perfect will teach, but without coercion. The perfect have been fulfilled in every aspect of the truth. The perfect will wander from one place to another and will teach everyone according to their particular needs, approaching everyone and teaching them in humility, mukoko, and love, hubo. They are entitled and called to do this because they have acquired knowledge or an understanding in perfection and truth. Mad ao ba gmiruto, perfection, uba shroro, truth, which is by and large the equivalent of the Evagrian gnosis, to my mind at least. For Evagrius too, the Gnosticus says or implies that the Gnosticus monk, monachos or Gnosticos, has a moral obligation to teach because he is the one who understands the reasons, tous logos. So let me come to my conclusion. Apparently, the main moral proposition of letter 20 is the seamless concatenation of praxis and gnosis. More precisely, the interdependence of the two. The emphasis laid on that is perhaps a novelty as compared to Evagrius's own accents. Perhaps not. In any case, Maximus appears to reflect on his own condition as it has been traced in the introductory part of the letter, as he spells out then step by step how a monk should not teach. There are conditions to teaching. The rule is that it is prohibited to teach unless you have become ascetically virtuous, which perhaps implies a development of Evagrian doctrine, in that for Maximus, the Gnosticus outstrips is better than the Practicus, better in quotes, but only by virtue of having previously become perfect teleios. And this condition must invariably obtain. In this sense, letter 20 may be read in Evagrian terms as a reprimand addressed to a Gnosticus who has lost the praxis, whose gnosis no longer connects with praxis, and who therefore must backtrack. Whether that moral and spiritual condition is bound up with an ecclesiastic scandal implying Maximus must remain an open question for now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Miklos, for this enlightening paper. It's open to questions. Father Alexander.
Thank you. Just do you have some ideas about these convictions of St. Maximus? What can be issue or about what happens?
Yeah, Dr. Jankowiak and Dr. Booth advance an actually convincing hypothesis, which relies on the Syriac life. Okay, so there's only this witness on the basis of which you can build this hypothesis. Namely, the Syriac life says, as you know, that there was a synod in Cyprus. We don't know about that, as far as I know, from any other source. But the Syriac life insists that there was a synod on Cyprus where Arcadius, I think, the bishop of one bishop of Cyprus, assisted, and somebody from representing Maximus's views, but Maximus himself was not there. So this is specified by the Syriac life. And then the Syriac life continues to tell us that on this synod, during this synod, Maximus's doctrine, I think, is this is perhaps not specified which doctrine, but probably Dio-energism was condemned. And so Dr. Jankowiak and Dr. Booth say, okay, this is it. So that's where he
Yeah, I know, but so you agree with them.
You know, I'm arguing that this is absolutely uncertain, and that the letter is, you know, more of a.
This was my question because.
Okay.
Another proposal for dating. So I think you agree with this understanding, or have maybe some other idea.
This may be true, but it's conjectural, I think, hypothetical at least.
Okay, thank you.
May I ask a naive question? Does Maximus there use the word Gnostikos himself?
Well, gnosis often. Gnosis is there, like several times. Okay, we should go back to check for Gnostikos. But, you know, there is this pretty clear sort of opposition between praxis and gnosis in the text of the letter. So I think it is useful to hint at or to refer to the Evagrian sort of bipartite system, which makes sense of this entire situation, mental situation of a fight between, you know, the vocation to step forward, whether I have to embrace teaching or should I just remain silent and practice the virtues in an ascetic manner.
Vladimir has a question. This time I noticed.
Thank you very much, Miklos. Well, my question is very kind of, I don't know, out of ignorance. Well, it's obvious that Maximus is very much indebted to Evagrius in the language and everything. And if you read just the Ambiguum 10, you can find a lot of ideas there. And my question is now, of course, now we have more and more material coming out. We have like a big chunk of passages where Maximus is citing Origen. And I'm curious what kind of Evagrius work he could use in the 7th century. Is this kind of something like a Syriac version, or you think that there were preserved Greek texts circulating around? I'm just out of ignorance questions.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. This is a good one, right? Good question. Difficult to answer because I'm not so much into the philological and historical part of it, but, you know, we do know some things. Okay, as you have also mentioned, Evagrian doctrine is there. For instance, in Maximus's theory of prayer, like that really, I think, relies on Evagrius's on prayer. So it is kind of only I'm applying that Evagrian terms are there in Maximus. I'm applying that fact on the letter 20. So, okay, Evagrius is there, but do we know how Maximus got to use Evagrian texts in historical and philological terms? Okay, early on, Evagrius appears already in some monastic sources as a heretic. I think I read this in John Moskos's Spiritual Meadow, or in maybe I don't remember, but either in Theodoret of Cyrus or in John Moskos, there is one particular story in which a monk wants to occupy the cella the cell of where Evagrius lived, and then the higumen doesn't allow him to do that because a big heretic has lived in that chamber. And so when the monk insists and occupies Evagrius's chamber, then he dies within 2 weeks, committing suicide. So even in the monastic sources, at least some of them, Evagrius, while he is a towering figure of early monasticism, appears also as a big heretic, an arch heretic. So it is a good question of whether Maximus could get any of his texts really. But I think the answer is yes, because Evagrian texts disappeared, many of them, in Greek original, but they survived, in Syriac and Armenian translation. So especially in Syria, there is a strong presence of Evagrian doctrine and texts. I think even in historical and philological terms, we can rest assured that Evagrius was available. So that would be my schematic answer, sketchy as it is.
Yeah, well, that's something I want to hear. Yeah, I thought that it might be a solution. Thank
you very much to Miklos. I think the conference have to go on. And it's a special pleasure to give the word. Yes, go please, to go back to Łukasz Milichevich, whom we already welcomed at this conference, at the very first conference, and it's a great thing to see him back in action. So, to you.
Invitation again.
Yes.
So, Theosis and Adiaretos are most in St Maximus the Confessor. Is it okay now? In his letters, St. Maximus not once elaborates the concept of deification or theosis. There is no wonder about that, since this concept is one of his major theological preoccupations. St. Maximus elaborates the concept of deification even when he does not use the technical term theosis itself, but there are several places in the letters where the term itself is used, and in a very specific sense. Thus, when writing to John Cubicularius about love, Maximus says that nothing is godlier or more mysterious than divine love, nor is there anything more sublime for the purpose of human deification, or the mystery of love is that which turns us from men into gods. These translations are mine, so I'm not quoting any specific edition. That what is meant here is the deification as final eschatological reality is beyond any doubt, since Maximus immediately adds that love is that which enables us to participate in that which is the object of faith and hope, because through it, that which is to be is already acquired as present. Therefore, dealing with the concept of deification, one should understand it fundamentally as the final reality, as the eschatological realization of what St. Maximus otherwise names as the mystery of Christ, and that is the final and complete union of Creator and his creation. Maximus describes this eschatological reality of deification in many places in his letters. I will draw your attention to just a few of them, and especially to those that are distinguished by their explicitness and boldness. Our goal is, Maximus says in his Logos to George the Eparch, to become entirely and only gods, so that in every movement of our soul and body we reflect the rays of divinity. And to put it simply, to partake in God completely, to become fully and in every respect gods by grace, even to the extent that by everything we can consider ourselves to be another him, apart from being identified with him by the essence. Because that is exactly what perfection is, not to bear even a single mark of this age or aeon in ourselves. All this is possible because God, Maximus says, is in his 24th letter to John Sacellarius, made us for this purpose, to become partakers of the divine nature and of his absolute eternity, Idiotes, that in everything we show ourselves to be similar to him by the grace of deification, because of which all beings exist and are being maintained, and because of which they came into being. Maximus will repeat this sentence verbatim in his 43rd letter to John Cubicularius again, saying that our goal is to belong in our entirety to God alone and only, so that nothing of this world remains in us, that by drawing closer to God, we become gods, by receiving from God the gift of being gods. All this is possible, Maximus writes in his 44th letter to the same addressee, and this would be, let me be personal, my favorite Maximian thought, because God loved us not as himself, but even more than himself. Again, in his already mentioned first letter to George the Eparch, Maximus described this reality of union with divinity in a somewhat more abstract way. Divinity, he says, is one and unique, passionless, and in such a way that absolutely nothing apart from him and by essence different from him eternally can neither be thought nor imagined, because nothing that is of him does not reach him. However, the one who has fixed his will or intention by striving has himself become one and the same and passionless by the absolute character of his inclination towards the one and the same, I say, and immutable. For the only thing he longs for is the one, and the one is certainly immutable, since it is essentially immovable due to its natural infinity. Immovable infinity has nowhere to move. So therefore, he being himself a lover of the one, erastis or erastes, by all probability has become himself one and the same and immutable, since in every respect, in accordance with the one, he made his will or his choice immovable. Deification, therefore, is the reality of one's likening to the point of identification with the one, which is elsewhere regularly named as the divine monad, the one or divine monad, and identified with the Holy Trinity. The one and only limit to the reality of divine likening is identification by essence. In all other respects, as we have seen, the being that is deified becomes in everything like katacharin, according to grace, to the Creator. The question I want to ask in this regard is whether this differentiation implies, in the perspective of final eschatological fulfillment, any kind of, I will call it in this way, ontological deprivation or deficiency of the created being in relation to its creator. Or to put it simply, will God in the end keep something for himself, or will he give us everything? If the answer is negative, and I will show that it's exactly the case, the question that necessarily follows is whether this leads us to the final deletion of the difference between the creator and the creation. That is, whether the eschatological vision of this kind necessarily ends up in some kind of pantheism, which is of course unacceptable for Christian orthodoxy. As I have already said, the answer to the first question is negative. The final mode of creation's existence, according to the vision of St. Maximus, is such that it excludes any deficiency of the created in terms of ontology in relation to the creator. Material world will ultimately participate in the fullness of the divine life. Although one may conclude this, I find, from the deification accounts that I've already quoted, there are many other places in which St. Maximus writes even more explicitly about the way in which creation acquires the attributes of the divine nature. Thus, in his well-known expounding of his mystical theories about Melchizedek, of which I've spoken on our first meeting, I think, Maximus explicitly writes that deification implies not only the absence of the perspective of n in the created being, namely its infinity, but also its beginninglessness, which is, of course, an essential characteristic of divinity. Therefore, the absence of identification by substance or nature does not exclude the complete participation in and perfect acquisition of properties of that same nature, but actually implies it. And this applies even to the most divine property, the beginninglessness of being. The answer to the second question is to some extent already given. The distinction marked by the terms katacharin and kataphysin precisely serves the theological articulation of the concept of unity, which excludes the pantheistic connotation. This distinction is, of course, completely founded on the general Christian doctrine of creation. However, in order to fully understand the connection between the doctrine of creation and Maximus's vision of its eschatological fulfillment, all that is, and that is deification, it is very important to pay attention to what Maximus says in one of the passages that I've already quoted, namely, there is continuity between the deification by grace and the very creation and existence of the world. created being does not exist independently of the deification, because the very act of creation aims at it. Hence, this act, the act of creation, as well as its current existence or created being, are also by grace, katacharin. One may say that here we are facing the basic thesis of Christian cosmology. The existence of creation is not a consequence of an internal ontological necessity, but of an unnecessary, or one may say free, creative act. However, this expected answer does not explain an important aspect of the problem to which I now wish to draw your attention. Namely, is there something like a logical apparatus that allows such claims to be something more than a simple set of doctrine or dogmas whose truth is ultimately explained, under quotation marks, by the principle of authority? No, I am far from trying to prove their logical necessity per se, but the question I will try to answer is whether there are some logical tools that might connect them internally into a coherent system within which contradictions, even when they cannot be avoided, are not accepted as normal or even necessary. More concretely, how is it possible for a created being to fully become a god while preserving its difference in relation to the creator? Isn't the already mentioned ontological deficiency itself that which distinguishes it and consequently separates it from the creator? And if it is separated from him, then in no case can it fully become a god, no matter how close it gets to him. Isn't Maximus's claim that deification is complete contradictory to the claim, isn't Maximus's claim that deification is complete contradictory to the claim that it excludes identification by essence? Well, it's not, and here's why. The distinction between difference, or diaphora, and separation or division, diaeresis, is one of the key topoi in Maximus's theological logic. Basically, Maximus relies entirely on the theology of earlier eras. But what distinguishes him, I find, is precisely the attempt to explain this principle as logically acceptable and consistent. The distinction between difference and division is crucial for both triadology and Christology. In short, to distinguish the divine hypostasis of the Holy Trinity does not imply any division between them or an ontological deficiency of one compared to the other. This was, of course, the key argument of the Neo-Nicene triadology. The Son and the Spirit, being different hypostases, are not because of that less divine in relation to the Father. The main argument also of Neo-Chalcedonian Christology, whose most prominent representative is certainly Maximus himself, consists precisely in the application of the Neo-Nicene triadological argument to Christology. Just as the hypostatic distinction between the persons of the Holy Trinity does not imply any division between them, so the distinction between the two natures of the incarnate Logos excludes any division and ontological deficiency of one compared to the other. Despite the asymmetric character of Neo-Chalcedonian Christology, it is inadmissible to say that Christ is less human than God. Namely, if we were to allow it, such a claim would lead to the collapse of the entire system of Neo-Chalcedonian theology. In order to explain this logically, St. Maximus turns to what might be called the kind of theological philosophy of mathematics. This is exactly where adiaretos arithmos comes into play. Thus, in his 13th letter to Peter the Illustrious, Maximus says, each number taken by itself neither divides anything, nor can it be divided, nor can it be taken by itself a factor of whatever kind of unity. And the fact that it can neither act nor be acted upon is a consequence of the fact that the number is neither an essence nor a property, for which it is only possible to speak of acting and being acted upon, but it is just an indicator of the quantity of the things in question. In his 15th letter to Deacon Cosmas, Maximus repeats these thoughts, giving an even more detailed consideration of the same issue. In itself, every number is adiaretos, since it neither moves by change, which would be characteristic of a property, nor by contraction and expansion, systole and diastole, which would be characteristic of an essence, nor by growth and diminution, which would be characteristic of the quantity of something. Number is therefore a mere signification of quantity, not of relation, and only of simple quantity, not of quantity determined in any way. It is therefore clear that it cannot be the cause of either division or unity. Furthermore, Maximus says that this is precisely the reason why the definitions of things do not include numbers. In this sense, there is nothing illogical in the claim that by counting the nature of Christ or the hypostasis of the Holy Trinity, one in no way implies their separation. It is a quantitative distinction that does not necessarily say anything about the nature of the relation between the things that differ by number. And in both cases, we are talking about the relations of unity, and this unity is in no way threatened by number and differences signified by it. But on the contrary, the unity is precisely affirmed through them. Here we face a kind of dialectic, what the French theologian Yves Congar once called, in more inspired and poetic way, the cascade of love. The unity of the Holy Trinity, which one might say is the content of the divine monad, in Christ's hypostasis is projected into the relationship of his two natures. And that is why they are, to use the famous Chalcedonian concept, both different, which is signified by the adverb asynhytos, and inseparable and indivisible, just like the hypostasis of the Holy Trinity. In both cases, the difference fully correlates to the inseparability. Counting the hypostasis of the Holy Trinity and the natures of Christ indicates they should not be confused, because the difference, Maximus tells us in his already quoted 15th letter, is the cause or the logos of preserving the mutual otherness of what is signified. And that will be his definition of diaphora. Now the question follows. Is it possible to apply the same logic in order to explain the relationship between the creator and the creation in the perspective of their final union? That is, in the perspective of the final deification of the creation. I find that it is not just possible, but necessary, and that Maximus's accounts of deification directly suggest this. Creation will finally be united completely and inseparably, or adieretos. The quality of this unity fully corresponds to the quality of the unity of the hypostasis of the Holy Trinity or the natures of Christ. Despite the fact that in all three cases we find different modes of it, its content is the very life of the divine monad. As in the case of triadology and Christology, in deification too we find a differentiating principle that guarantees that there will be no confusion, but which at the same time does not compromise unity. In this case, it is what Maximus, along with most of the patristic tradition, describes by distinguishing between what is katacharin and kataphysin. Consequently, when it comes to the question of ontological deficiency between what is katacharin and kataphysin, there is no difference in terms of quality, but only in terms of form or mode. Therefore, the solution to the question that Maximus's radical concept of deification brings with it should be sought in an effort to consistently apply the logic by means of which the triadological and Christological questions were solved to the field of theological anthropology. And the fact that theological anthropology focused on the concept of deification is actually a key topos of pneumatology. Starting from the New Testament, the grace of deification is always in effect and the sign of the Spirit's presence, makes such an effort all the more logical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very inspiring paper. Thank you. May I kick up with the questions? And if talking of mathematical knowledge, where did Maximus get it from? What are the sources?
Well, I didn't manage to investigate all the sources, but I can tell you anything more than what is already known in terms of his formal sources. But I would try to investigate that in some perspective. What I think is the question here is that he uses some current philosophical ideas, and these ideas are basically Neoplatonic. And what is also the very important supplement to his Neoplatonicism is his Stoicism when it comes to his cosmology. And this is very important when he deals with the status of the created world in the perspective of final eschatological fulfillment. But I cannot tell you precisely about this concept, adieretos arithmos, what is its origin. What is significant here is that the adverb, the adjective adieretos completely corresponds to the Chalcedonian definition, which uses adjective adieretos. So it's very interesting, and I think it's not. I think it's on purpose. In fact, he discusses the question of adieretos arithmos in his letters where he deals with the Severian Christology. So it's basically Christological argument, but of mathematical origin.
Thank you. More questions, Father Alexander?
I have one question. At the end of your lecture, this suggestion of how to understand Maximus' understanding of deification. Well, it seems to me a little bit problematic because in Maximus, actually, maybe not in your proposal. Well, what actually, if something, will be the difference between God and created beings, if beginningless will be something that belong to created beings. So even this. So what will be because I ask this because if you said that, as I maybe wrongly understood, at the end of your lecture, you said that the only difference will be like the difference between hypostasis in the Trinity, but then we will have more than 3 hypostases. Yeah. So this is the problem. And if we said that this will not be the case, then what will be actually with created hypostasis? They will disappear, or and I will just 30 seconds. Maybe one offer for the solution. What Vladimir mentioned about this maybe little bit hidden originism of Maximus. Well, in this first letter, you cite this. He said there that at the end in deification, there will be everything will become spiritual. And the strange things will happen. He don't defy these strange things. Maybe he and on some other places in Maximus, it looked like to me that maybe he believed that everything will become spiritual, not really material, or material in quotes to say. I don't know. What do you think about this?
Well, I think that in Maximus, material and spiritual are not excluded mutually, because material world will be transformed spiritually, and of course, this
transformed spiritually or transformed to spiritually to become spiritual. Or I'm not sure about this.
I think that in order to understand what is the issue here, we must deal with the doctrine of creation. And I think that Maximus is, and I think that I've shown that in my doctoral thesis, is very much adapted on St. Gregory of Nyssa and his doctrine of the creation from the God, ek theou. So that materiality is a kind of mode of God's will, which has got its, as St. Gregory says, hyparxis. So, God's will exists, this world exists as hyparxis of God's will. And in order to answer to your first question, what would be the difference? Well, the difference would be the mode of the acquisition of that status. And that mode of the acquisition is kataharin. That's what he wants to say. And how to explain that? Well, I'm not sure. There are many possibilities, but it's the same basically as how to explain the difference between hypostases or between two natures. He uses the same terms in order to describe all these levels of reality. But what is basically the same is the quality of unity, which is at the end divine unity itself. So that's why I said a cascade of love. It's more poetic and maybe more appropriate to speak in these terms, but why not trying to deal with it in terms of something that is similar to logic, if not logic itself.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I think we have 5 minutes. We can allow ourselves a 5-minute break before we. Oh, there is 2 questions. Vladimir has a question. Oh, sorry, I didn't notice.
Well, thank you. Well,
he cannot miss.
Father Bukashin, thank you for your very, very rich and enlightening paper. Well, my question goes when you mentioned Holy Trinity in the context of monad. I'm curious, what would be your answer? Because you probably know this passage in Mystagogia 5, when Maximus is pointing to God, like following Dionysius Areopagite as truth, good, one, and unique. It's this very kind of known scheme that he's using Dionysius terms of united unities and united differentiations. When like the essence is united unity, energies are united differentiated unity, Trinity is united differentiation, and then you have a reference to incarnation as differentiated differentiation. And then Maximus is using truth to explain essence, good to explain energy, one or oneness to explain the Trinity, and uniqueness to explain. And now my question, why do you think that he's actually going against previous tradition, when always essence, unity of essence or unity of energies are taken as oneness of the Trinity, while we have once here, you will have like a 3 hypostases which are guarantee of the oneness of Trinity or monad of God.
Well, I think that we'll have to discuss this elaborately on some other occasion, but I will try to answer briefly now. What I think is that in Maximus, as well as in St. Gregory and all Neo-Nicene fathers, what is issue there is that Trinitarian aspect completely corresponds to the oneness of God. I mean, Trinity is Trinity because it's monad, and it's monad because it's Trinity. There is that his famous definition of which I cannot quote now verbatim of divine monad. In his, I think it's a prologue to the answers to Thalassisos, and that is important. When we say that God is one, we say that God is unity, not one in his in completely Neoplatonic manner, but one understood as the mystery of unity. And if we speak about unity, then we speak about unity of something or someone, and that is why Trinitarian moment and the monadic moment, call it like that, completely correspond one to another. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Miklos, thank you. Miklos had a question. There you go.
Are we missing our break or? Yeah. Because, yeah, then I try not to be long. You were arguing for a complete identification in eschatological times of the believer, of creation with the creator, though there will be differences. But Maximus in Opuscule 2, maybe, he explicitly says what the difference is. There remains a difference, and that regards the wills. Our will in the condition when we have been unified with God will not be identical with that of God. We'll keep our human will, although it will conform to divine will. But the two wills remain in that condition too.
The identification of which I've spoken means that the difference is preserved. And this difference here is signified by the differentiation between kataharin and kataphysin. Or in some other places in his works, he says that for us, our deification of, or our status of gods will be our pathos. And for God, it's his energy in relation to us. So for us, it's pathos, it's a gift. It's kataharin. Kataharin means it's gift. And that's the only difference, one and only difference. But there is, difference will be preserved. Otherwise, we would face very directly pantheism. So it's not pantheism, but one may think about that, whether it's a good way to avoid pantheism.
Okay, and then could you give us the reference where you cited in the middle of your talk a passage from letter 13? Mm-hmm. I'm searching Patrologia right now to find about the unity, the adiairetos.
Okay, arithmos. Adiairetos arithmos. I'll find it and I'll give you.
Okay, and the last remark. Yeah, Vladimir has already started to talk about this, the monad or monas, goddess and monas. You were making the remark that when you were responding to Alex, you made the remark that, you know, this theory of Maximus is Neoplatonic in origin. But, you know, that's a difficult position. He, I think in Ambigua, in one of the early, no, in the Thomas Ambigua somewhere, he fights back against Platonics or Platonists, saying that that's not our position. So I think we have to be kind of careful when we apply Platonism or Neoplatonism, when we say that patristic authors are Platonic or Neoplatonic, because they also refuse large portions of Platonism. So where is the line? Because of which we cannot say that Maximus is fully Platonic. So he is Christian, but embracing parts of Platonism.
Well, one might argue that Neoplatonicism is not fully Platonic. So in the same way, patristic Platonicism is not the same thing as Neoplatonic Platonicism. So there are different tendencies. I think that the doctrine of creation is one is the limitation which quite well serves the purpose. So that's where I think, but again, when St. Gregory exposes his doctrine on creation, his logic is Neoplatonic.
Dear colleagues, we are already sort of, yes, we are 1 minute like with the Japanese train, you know, we are not, we go by schedule. It's time to give the word to George Siskos, and it's a pleasure to hear from him about Severan criticisms of Maximus. So, George, please.
Alex, Vladimir, thank you very much for the invitation. Do you hear me quite well? Thank you. Thanks to all of you that you're hosting me. Allow me for 1 second to share with you a little presentation. The epistles of, do you see it? Okay, I see that you see it. The epistles of St. Maximus against the Christology of Severus of Antioch serve as a basis for the later Maximian Apuscular Theologica and Polemica against monenergism and monotheletism. The interpretation of St. Maximus is being repeated in the later Apuscula with the necessary notional adoptions against monotheletism. In Epistle 12, St. Maximus introduces to John Cubicularius to the doctrinal content of the epistle with a confession of faith. He characterizes the hermeneutical tradition of the Church as the medicine of salvation, and he contrasted with the ill-minded opinions of Severus. The confession of faith contains the expressions A, the one of the Trinity who was incarnated, which is of anti-Nestorian origin, B, Theotokos, C, the most important pronoun, the one and the same, which comes back at least to the conciliar letter of the Council of Antioch, 268, which condemned Paul of Samosata and was repeated extensively to the formula of reunion of 433 and the Council of Chalcedon. D, the double consubstantiality and the double birth from God the Father and the Theotokos. St. Maximus in the same confession introduces the hermeneutical principles that he's going to explicate. The first and definitely one of the most crucial one is the direct correlation between existent things and their respective names. If a thing exists in reality, then by necessity it has to be named and confessed as existent. If Christ is God and Christ is man, then by necessity Christ is two natures which must be confessed. This is obviously in total opposition with the Christology of Severus, who confirmed the humanity and the divinity of Christ as one composed nature and hypostasis. Answering to the classic anti-Chalcedonian principle, both Nestorian and Monophysite alike, that no nature exists without a hypostasis of its own, St. Maximus speaks that the flesh of Christ receives its being, to είναι, and subsisting, to hypostine, in God the Word himself. Being and subsisting in Greek are the infinitives of the noun essence and hypostasis. St. Maximus never accepts a second hypostasis in Christ, but he uses the word in its infinite form for the flesh. Leontius of Byzantium and Leontius of Jerusalem had already turned the definition of hypostasis to the agent of the thing defined. The hypostasis corresponds to the who of a thing. St. Maximus uses these specific grammatical forms, i.e. being, to είναι, and subsisting, to hypostine, because he wants to prove that God the Word is the agent of the flesh and no other. Additionally, the Nestorians, followed by the Monophysites, posed the argument that it is impossible for a thing not to be distinguished by a hypostasis of its own. Therefore, in the case of Christ, he had to be distinguished from men through the hypostasis of Jesus the man, and he had to be distinguished from the other persons of the Trinity through the hypostasis of God the Word. On the contrary, for St. Maximus and Orthodox tradition, the fact that God the Word is the exclusive agent of the humanity and the divinity does not mean that Christ's humanity does not include all the distinguishing properties that constitute it as a concrete individual among humans. The humanity of Christ is a nature with particular properties, as in the case of every human being. This does not mean that Christ's humanity is a self-subsistent hypostasis, as in the case of every other human being, but it exists as an hypostaton, i.e. receiving its existence from God the Word. The second hermeneutical principle of St. Maximus is the notion of difference. It is repeated in all the anti-Severan epistles. Severus of Antioch's notion of difference when speaking of natures is identical with division. The reason is the already mentioned nucleus principle that every natural thing exists only as self-subsistent hypostasis, and therefore for Severus, two natures must by necessity mean two hypostases. The alternative for Severus is the confession of the natural qualities of the divinities and humanity without confessing their respective natures. Relying upon these historical premises, St. Maximus proceeds to a redefinition of difference and division. The difference is the notion of the how a thing is in relation to some other, whereas division is the radical split between the subjects, which manifests every subject individually, idia, by itself, καθεαυτά, and apart from each other, anameros. It's interestingly enough that this is the terminology of St. Kirill, even in his Trinitarian writings. This is exactly St. Kirill's terminology against Nestorius. Turning again to the first hermeneutical principle, St. Maximus considers it as unthinkable not to confess the two different natures of Christ. Christ is God and Christ is man, the one and the same. The difference is not annihilated after the union, and the Orthodox confess two different natures in Christ. Reinterpreting the texts of St. Kirill, it's very important for St. Maximus. The confessor collects passages that speaks on the natural difference in Christ. The problem of division is the split of nature into two agents, not the simple mention of different natures after the union. For Severus, those two are identical. For St. Maximus, if the division is identical with difference, then the confusion of the nature comes as the inevitable consequence of the one nature and hypostasis in Christ. Conversely, if no alteration happens to the divinity and the humanity of Christ, then a difference without division must be confessed. The notion of difference in the divinity and the humanity of Christ becomes a void name when different things are not confessed. Difference in reality means naming the different things that constitute the unity. The third hermeneutical principle of St. Maximus present in the four epistles is the use of number as the cognitive sign for the amount of the different things that were united. For Severus of Antioch, the number 2 is the name of division according to every possible signification and the mode of existence. St. Maximus resorts to St. Gregory the theologian, who says regarding the Holy Trinity that the enumeration shows the amount of the divine hypostasis, not some kind of ontological degradation, as Eunomius believed. The number as a cognitive sign is not an actual substance, therefore it cannot divide any essences. The number refers to the quantity of beings and not their division or their continuation as united realities. For St. Maximus, the notion of number is closely connected with the notion of difference. If there is to be a difference at all among beings, then the things differed can't be enumerated. The absence of enumeration is an absence of difference. St. Maximus, in order to clarify the notion of difference as a pious enumeration of the things differed, he goes on to interpret St. Kirill's formula of the one nature of the incarnated Word. There are two modes of interpretation when someone approaches the mystery of incarnation. The one is the mode of difference according to the natures of Christ, and this mode of difference is signified through the number. The second mode is the mode of union according to the hypostasis of God the Word, and this mode is signified through the formula of St. Kirill. These two modes of interpretation are not comparable, since they refer to the reality of the natures and the reality of the hypostasis. The union is permanent. Therefore, Christ is one according to the mode of the hypostasis. The things differed remain permanently intact after the union. Therefore, the difference of the humanity and the divinity is confessed according to the quantity of the natures. It is an obvious necessity for the confession of the one according to the union and the confession of the two according to the difference. St. Maximus uses the logos-tropos distinction in order to push the anti-Chalcedonian logic to its limits. The consensus regarding the humanity and the divinity of Christ must include the oneness by some logos and tropos, as well as the twofold reality by some logos and tropos as well. Severus accepted only the expression from two natures, where he explicitly condemned the expression in two natures. From the two natures meant that the union is constituted from two hypostatic natures, to Severus I mean, that do not exist independently, but form one composed nature and hypostasis of the incarnated Word. On the contrary, the expression into natures meant by necessity two hypostatic natures which exist separately and apart. Relying on these premises, Severus was interpreting every dualistic expression of Kirill as something referred before the union. Duality after the union meant for Severus division in any way. Nestorius was speaking of undivided natures after the union, but for him, undivided natures meant only conjunction and the fellowship of two autonomous hypostatic subjects. Severus, by sharing the same philosophical presupposition with Nestorius, thought it for impossible that there could be two natures in the union without being autonomous hypostatic subjects. And the reason for that is the classic Aristotelian principle of reality, which describes the existing things as concrete entities. St. Maximus goes on to prove that undivided natures does not by necessity mean either two hypostatic natures in a conjunction or one composed nature from two hypostatic natures that cease to exist in the union, as Severus propounded. St. Maximus interprets Saint Kirill in the sense that the Alexandrian saint rejects the so-called undivided union from two individual hypostases, not the status of two undivided natures in one hypostasis. Of course, for the identical presupposition of Nestorius and Severus, this would have meant either confusion of the two natures in one hypostasis or a logical impossibility, because two natures by necessity mean two hypostases. For St. Maximus, following the Orthodox tradition, the natures of Christ are concrete and not some general substrata. Both of them exist as being one agent, i.e. God the Word. For Severus and Nestorius, such a thing is impossible exactly for the same reason. Two natures by necessity must exist as two hypostases or acting subjects or agents. St. Maximus is emphatic that St. Kirill never says that two natures by necessity mean two agents unconditionally. For St. Kirill, this happens, the confessor continues, only when the natures are considered as individual hypostases, i.e. by themselves and apart from each other. The Orthodox Church never speaks about two self-subsistent natures. Two natures subsisting by themselves turns the natural difference into division. St. Maximus repeats many times that the number one refers to the mode of union and the number two refers to the mode of difference. St. Maximus inherits the Cappadocian principle already used in St. Athanasius of the correspondence between nature and activities or attributes. The activities of a thing as well as its attributes derive from a specific nature. It is impossible for the attributes or the activities not to belong to a specific nature. Relying upon this fundamental premise, St. Maximus proves that when St. Kirill consented to the formula of reunion to ascribe the scriptural sayings in its nature of Christ, he didn't mean only different qualities deriving from one composite nature and hypostasis as Severus wanted, but St. Kirill actually meant two natures in Christ. For St. Maximus, Severus annihilates the nature of the humanity and the divinity by confessing only qualities without their underlying natures. Severus is presenting empty names without an actual content in reality. If the difference of the humanity and the divinity lies in plain natural qualities, then it is about a non-existent difference. Severus's composite nature and hypostasis is one concrete thing that manifests qualities belonging to different species. The hypostatic nature from which the composite nature exists, according to Severus, can be traced only in theory, but even then, even in theory, they cease to exist as hypostatic natures once the mind is illuminated by the union itself. The Antiochian Christology, from Theodore of Mopsuestia to Theodoret of Kyrus, had already criticized extensively the natural union which produces a composite nature. The main problem of a natural union in Christ is the necessity that encloses for its constituent parts. The humanity and the divinity are bound up in a necessary manner, which annihilates the divine freedom. St. Maximus takes this critique under consideration and goes further. He argues that the composite nature means the necessary coexistence of its constituent parts. As in the case of the body and soul, which come simultaneously in existence, by interpreting Christ as one composite nature, it comes as a result the simultaneous existence of the divinity and the humanity. The composite nature of Severus is A, a creature imposed by the necessary laws of created nature, B, contrary to the simplicity of uncreated nature, C, presenting God the Word as sharing a mutual temporality with the flesh. St. Maximus reverses the critique of Severus concerning the reality of a nature strictly either as self-subsistent or as the sum of the individuals of the class. Here lies the severe presupposition of his composite hypostasis, which is from two natures, but never two natures. Two natures would have meant two self-subsistent natures, which equals to division. The confessor responds that the composite nature can exist either as unique, individual, or as a generality. If the composite nature of Christ is unique, individual, then it is not consubstantial either with humanity or divinity. If the composite nature of Christ is a generality, then man can speak about a Christ species with multiple individual Christs. The anti-Chalcedonian understanding of the real things as self-subsistent hypostasis gave birth against the Chalcedonian tradition to the classic objection that there is no nature without a hypostasis of its own. The solution of the enipostaton given by the Leonti and other Chalcedonian writers seemed inadequate because the uncreated hypostasis of God the Word, being the hypostasis of the flesh, was equated with some kind of absurdity. St. Maximus in Epistle 15 proceeds to some daring expressions like the one that the flesh receives being and subsisting from God the Word, or that the humanity of Christ received its nature and also its hypostasis in God the Word. Severus was constantly refusing to accept the humanity of Christ as a second nature of God the Word. His objection was that if someone names a second nature in Christ, then by necessity man ends up with two options. First, the humanity, if it is to be real, it has to be self-subsistent, which leads inevitably to Nestorianism. Second, if the second nature of Christ is perceived as being the common characteristics of a species, then by necessity it is a generality, which includes all the individuals belonging to the species. The accusation of the anti-Chalcedonians that if there are two essences along with their particular properties, then by necessity there must be two hypostases, also according to the definition of hypostasis of St. Basil. St. Maximus responds by reintroducing the definition of hypostasis in St. Basil the Great. St. Basil in his Epistle 38 speaks about the difference between the nature and hypostasis as the difference between the common and the particular. For St. Maximus, both the humanity and the divinity in Christ have the common and the particular. The common of its nature shows the consubstantiality with the other persons of the Trinity and the humanity, whereas the particular of its nature it distinguishes the incarnated Word from the other persons of the Trinity and the humanity apart. This does not mean by necessity two hypostases. The reason for that lies in the fact that God the Word and his flesh never existed as separated entities. The confessor explains this with the paradigm of the union between the body and soul. The body and soul are not two separate hypostases, although different in species, and with individual properties that distinguish them from the other existent souls and bodies of humanity. Hypostasis here is directly linked with the thing existing by itself, and not by the definition of hypostasis as a particular individual distinguished from individuals belonging to the same consubstantial class. All these are going to be updated in the struggle against monothelitism and with all the notional semantics. Thank you very much and for your patience.
Yes, I do have. Thank you. Well, that's the George. Thank you very much for a very, very rich paper. Well, my question goes to the constitution and the relations of the nature. First, I will pose the question in two installments. Or first, do you think that Christ's hypostasis is something new and have a kind of added value in relations to both natures? And the second question, which follows from the first, you probably came across Maximus' idea that how he structured like a reality with two extremes and mean or middle terms. And then, well, I would say that he is using, but when it was previously mentioned, what is the level of Maximus' mathematical knowledge? It seems to me that he is quite familiar with mathematics, at least to this model of kind of harmonical relations, arithmetic relation, and geometrical relations, and that he's applying, I think that he's applying a golden rule. It's kind of I to B is equal to B to C, where A is Christ's hypostasis, B is his divine nature, and C is his human nature. It means that it's kind of asymmetrical kind of constitution, asymmetrical in the sense that human nature and divine nature are in asymmetrical relations, but they are not in asymmetrical relations toward one to another, but they are also in asymmetrical relations toward Christ's hypostasis. I'm just curious, what is your take on this?
I think that we must estimate very carefully to the historical data. I think that the schema of whole and parts, which is everywhere in St. Maximus, has a very accurate historical grounding already found in the Leondi as well. The Nestorians pushed the discussion after the Chalcedon in a in this way. Okay, let's take St. Basil. What's the definition of hypostasis in St. Basil? St. Basil says essence with particularities. So let's say, is Christ God? Is Christ God? Yes, he is. He's an essence. How is he differed from the other persons of the Trinity? With his particularity. First hypostasis. Is Christ a man? Yes, he is. So he has a human essence. Yes, definitely. How is he differed from Peter, from his mother, from everywhere else? From his particularities. And they said after that, so why don't you confess two hypostases along with us? How is it possible to have one hypostasis in two natures? We're saying the same thing. And the problem actually was, it seems that St. Maximus even, that's why I spoke about daring expression, that he even comes to write that the flesh has a hypostasis. But this does not mean that it has a hypostasis which is independent. This means that as a man, by the distinguishing properties of humanity, he is speaking with the other men. He's not distinguished from his mother by being generated. by the hypostatic property of being generated from the father. He is distinguished from his mother by the fact that he is 1 meter and 70 centimeters, by the fact that his voice is that loud, and so on. So that's why actually St. Maximus introduces, the Leondi before him introduces that they have both the common substratum, which is the humanity, which is found in everybody, as well as the divinity, which is found in the whole Trinity. And at the same time, he says that it has the particular, and these two are an hypostata. An hypostata means that he is the same agent. He's the same agent. And I think that the main problem with all this was the denial of the recognition of the mystery. In the Trinity, the mystery was, and this was the work of the Cappadocian fathers, the mystery was how is it possible for three hypostases to be one thing? But in that context, it was easier because we were in the spiritual world, whereas there's no space. So people perhaps thought that it's possible because there's no space, there is no time, so it can be 3 to 1. But when it came to Christ, it had to be two concrete realities, and because the one of the two was in space and time, it had to be two hypostases. But the problem was that they couldn't accept that he was one and the same, because they were entrapped to the Aristotelian logic that if A is A and B is B, A cannot be B in any way. That was the main problem for Nestorians and the Monophysites as well, that every nature has to have an hypostasis of his own. And that's why the Council of Chalcedon, the Oros of Chalcedon seemed a logical absurdity. It's impossible for one hypostasis to be in two natures. And that's why the argument, watch out for the argument of all the Nestorians who were saying, the mother of God gave birth to a man, not to God himself. Maria, the Virgin Mary, was not a goddess. It was the stumbling block that consubstantial realities give birth to consubstantial realities. It cannot give birth to something which is from another nature. So I think that the radical, I'm proceeding to the first question. The radical thing with the composite hypostasis is that it's unique in the universe, we can say, because we cannot find, St. Maximus says that also, but also Kirill before him, with not in such eloquent way. He was saying that we cannot find a composite hypostasis which has not a composite nature. Because composite nature means the coexistent realities of the two things coming together into existence. And Christ is the only new thing under the sun. It's the only miracle of the universe, which these laws cannot stand for him. And I think that the whole notion of difference and the whole notion of number, because we have already discussed it quite before, I think that derives from the Severan argumentation. That it is very impressive, the fact that in the whole dialogues with Orthodox and anti-Chalcedonians, they were saying to the Chalcedonians were saying to anti-Chalcedonians, do you confess that Christ is God and man? Yes, we confess. How much is those two? How much is those? We know how much is those, what we are denying to say. Why you are denying to say? Because if we say the number 2, this means division in any way. And that's where the number as a sign of naming the natures in a pious confession enter into the discussion very, very deeply. All these things were worked by the Leonti, but St. Maximus has the unique charisma of putting the non-necessary things and putting all the necessary things in the expressions. Leonti had 60 arguments. Maximus keeps the 8 and makes it as a marketing project for the people of the empire, because how much theology could the politicians can afford? Because you see, it's to John Cubicularis and Peter the Illustrious and these people from the court. So thank you very much for the whole attention.
Thank you very much to George. It's awfully interesting, and we would like to continue, but we're stealing time from Father Alexander Jakovac, whom we absolutely wish to hear, who doesn't need introduction in this circle.
Thank you. So yes, my topic is some aspects of Pronoia and Logoi in the first letter of St Maximus. I a little bit changed this topic. So Maximus' understanding of Pronoia and Logoi is very well researched, and a large number of quality works have been written on those terms, which I will not refer now, as they are well known. The concepts of Pronoia and Logoi are among the central terms of Maximus' theological thought. The historical path of the development of these concepts, including St. Maximus, is provided by Benevich in his excellent study, on which I rely. These terms largely define his entire ontology, which is reflected in all key theological areas, especially triadology, Christology, and eschatology. Maximus' first letter places this concept in an interesting context. The reason for this is probably the fact that this letter was written in special circumstances and with a special purpose. According to Sherwood and also to Jankowiak and Booth, the letter was probably written early in 642 and was addressed to the prefect Georg or George at the time when he was called to Constantinople and faced with many inconveniences. Maximus developed a close friendship with George, and George proved to be a great supporter of the Orthodox. Whether it was the result of misunderstanding or an intention, George ignored the request of Empress Martina to resolve some monophysite nuns from the who were forcibly sent to the Orthodox monasteries. Maximus was hard hit by this accusation against George, whom he tried to help in every way, either by comforting him through a letter or by prayers of monks for his well-being. Saint Maximus writes this letter as a consolation to a friend who is in trouble, but also as one of who finds himself in the role of George's spiritual father. Those who knew Maximus' manner of writing will not be surprised that in this letter of this purpose, we find delicate theological observations. Nevertheless, the motive for writing this letter constituted the framework in which Maximus presents his ideas. In this practical application of complex theological ideas that give us the opportunity to look at them from a somewhat different angle. Therefore, I hope that with this analysis, with the analysis that follow, I will make a small contribution to their better understanding. Maximus' teaching about the Logos and Logoi in all possible aspects has been totally investigated. So for this occasion, I will limit myself only to the statement that for him, Logoi represent God's will for the world. Logoi and the nature of creation are distinct from each other, as the Logoi represents God's plan for the world, and in that sense, the divine are divine, while the nature of other beings is created. Providence is providence in a way represents the function of logoi. According to Maximus, the divine providentially moves each and every being in accordance with the principle by which each one is naturally moved. This is from Ambigua 23. Maximus explained providence from several angles. On the one hand, it represents God's care for the world in general and for its individual parts. In this sense, providence determines the combination and the distinction of everything with everything else, and the succession of everything and each thing by specific kind, which is perpetually preserved in such a way that the principle of each nature remains inviolate, without being confused with confusing with any other nature. It's from Ambigua 10. This function of providence is very reminiscent of one of the function of the logos of Philo of Alexandria. For Philo, the logos of has the role of articulating the undefined material substrate of the world through the process of separation and also of holding it together. The logos is both unifier and divider, Thomas. Maximus strongly rejects the idea that the providence does not care about particular beings. God cares about both particular and universal things. If he did not take care of the particulars, they will disappear, and then the universal will disappear as well. For it is in them that the universals have their permanence and subsistence. It's from Ambigua. Although particular things are many and subject to change, God provides for each of them God has providence for each of them in all situations. In Ambigua 10:42, Maximus referred to Nemesius and defines providence as follows. For providence, according to our God-bearing fathers, is God's attentive care for all things, and they also define it as follows. Providence is that purpose of God whereby all beings receive their most favorable assistance and direction. If then providence is God's purpose, to use the language of our teachers, then it is necessary follows that whatever happens for the right reason and could not have been better arranged. End of quotation. A certain parallel between the Stoic understanding of nature and Maximus' understanding of providence is quite obvious, but it is not so important now, since certain Stoic views have long since before commonplaces. In the same section of the Ambigua 10, as one of the proofs of God's providence, Maximus reminds us that when people find themselves in some sudden trouble without any prior thought, they turn to God and ask Him for help, according to him. This is a clear proof for the existence of God's providence, because nature will not have the inclination to address something that does not exist. Another question arises here. Does Maximus think that providence takes care of all concrete events in the history of each individual? If so, where is the line between providence and fate? Or is providence, at least when it comes to individual living beings, somehow equated with instincts? At the beginning of the dispute with Theodosius, the bishop asked him how he is, to which Maximus replies, as God preordinated before all ages, as a way of life for me in his providence. That's how I am. Theodosius asked him, did God preordain our individual destinies before all time? Maximus replied, if he had foreknowledge, assuredly he preordinated as well. It seems that Theodosius is interested in the same thing as we are. If there Is there a difference between providence and predestination? The conversation continues, but Maximus' answer is not very clear. Theodosius, what is the exact meaning of the words had foreknowledge and preordained? Maximus, foreknowledge pertains to thought and words and actions which come from us. Predestination pertains to those actions which do not come from us. Now things become clear. Foreknowledge refers to what is up to us, while predestination refers to what is not up to us. Circumstances in life that are not up to us are in God's hand, and how we behave in those circumstances is up to us. The dialogue continues. Theodosius, what is the nature of those matters which are from us, and what is the nature of those which are not from us? Maximus, the matters which are from us are all acts of volition, that is to say, virtues and vices. Those which are not from us are an infliction of kind of punishments which happen to us, or their opposites. I mean that neither the punishment or illness is from us, nor the gladness of good health, although the operating causes of these states do not originate from within us. For example, the cause of illness is intemperance, just as the cause of good health is temperance. And the cause of the kingdom of heaven is the keeping of the commandments, just as the cause of eternal fire too is transgressing them. End of quote. From what we have learned so far from Maximus, it seems that he believes that only virtues and vices are up to us, while everything else comes by divine predestination. Although these external things are to some extent casually related to our behavior, that causality is relative. This understanding is confirmed by Maximus' claims from the first letter. He said, therefore, what apart from God also depends on our will and our capabilities, we should want to strive to achieve with our actions. On the other hand, everything that happens or doesn't happen according to our choice, we should leave it to God with satisfaction and trust that He takes care of everything as He wants and as He decides, without considering the logoi of His providence and caring to all at all, according to which everything in a way that is unknowable to us is guided toward its goal by God's unspeakable wisdom, even when the outcome of this logoi is contrary to our expectations. End of quotation. We see that the difference between what is up to us and what is not up to us is not based on partial causality, but on choice. It is up to us what we can choose, although illness and health are to some extent the result of our behavior. It is not in our power to choose whether we will be healthy or ill. And a little later, Maximus continues in the same letter. Consequently, if we separate what is not up to us from what is up to us, we will be able to believe that the former belongs entirely to divine providence, while the later, apart from belonging to divine providence, also depends on our free will. According to Maximus, God's logoi about creation and man represent His desires for what creation should be. These logoi are laid down in the nature of created beings, and there they show themselves as a natural inclination to do what is in accordance with God's ultimate purpose. As we have seen, this striving, which is a bit like instinct, is one of the forms of providence. We could call this aspect internal, but providence also have its external aspects, and those are all those circumstances that we cannot influence. The list of those things is similar, if not identical, to the Stoic one. We will return again to the Maximus conversation with Theodosius. Theodosius asked him about the bad things that happened to us and whether they are also according to God's plan. According to Maximus, they undoubtedly are. Bad things, such as illness or suffering, can come to us as an opportunity to atone for our past sins or as a test of our will. He said, and every one of the saints who suffered involuntarily in this life suffered in accordance with such agreements, so that through the weakness which allows them to be burdened, they might trample on the proud and apostate serpent that is the devil. In addition to serving as an opportunity for repentance and for exercising the will, providence also brings us suffering so that we will not be attached to the things of this world, since they are changeable and transitory. In the first letter, Maximus gives advice that again sounds so stoic. Let us not desire what we cannot keep. Here we can see the didactic and soteriological aspect of providence. All circumstances that are not up to us come to us from God for the purpose of teaching, which should ultimately lead to salvation. Salvation is what is up to us because we are given the power to choose or not to choose it. For modern readers, the issue of theodicy immediately come to fore here. What about the suffering of the innocent? What about the immense suffering of so many people? To put it briefly, what about Auschwitz? Are they all logoi of providence that we simply cannot understand? According to Maximus, that's exactly how things are. The world is passing away, and everything that happens in history has significance only with regard to eschatology. We can also see a logical problem. If any suffering that happened to us was caused by the actions of other people, that is by their free evil will, then how can it be according to God's predestination? But Maximus does not ask this question at all. The last segment of the letter, and a rather large one, is devoted to eschatology. Maximus here describes the last judgment in detail and highlights the eternal torment of them. The teaching of apokatastasis is clearly rejected. Toward the very end of the letter follows a somewhat strange section. He said, and then the visible world will pass away, reaching its end, and the new hidden world of spiritual beings will appear, revealing the sight, hearing, and reason, quite strange things. What these strange things are, Maximus do not reveal to us. It is true that immediately afterwards, he mentioned bodily resurrection, although it must be admittedly somewhat modesty. Did Maximus mean here that the resurrection actually represents the transformation of physical body into spiritual one? The context allows such an interpretation, but we not confidently assert them. To sum up, in this presentation, I limited myself to only some aspects of providence and logoi. We have seen that providence can be understood as a function of the logoi of nature. Providence appears in relation to us as external and internal. Providence also has a didactic function, and the ultimate goal is soteriological, and that is our voluntary agreement with the logoi of nature. Thank you.
Many thanks to Father Alexander for this illuminating talk. Any questions? Vladimir, I can see him. There he goes.
Well, I just it was applause. It was not a question. No, if there is a, but I think that Father Vukasin has.
Yes, Vukasin has a question.
Just a short one. So, how stoic is Maximus from 1 to 10, according to your opinion here? How stoic is Maximus from 1 to 10?
7.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that of course, in his time, many Stoics ideas become commonplace, and it's not maybe really Stoics, but it is, but not from Stoic. I'm not sure that he read them or not. But of course, this how he understood God providence is very similar. How Stoics understood nature, as I mentioned.
Father Alexander, can you just recapitulate the difference Maximus is making between a foreknowledge and predestination? I couldn't follow somehow. Just a summary of what you said.
Actually, he didn't, because if there is God providence or God foreknowledge, then there is predestination. So actually, what he wanted to say is that everything is predestinated. Everything what happened to us. Only one thing is not. Our virtue, how we deal with all these circumstances,
our reactions.
How we react, but everything else is predestinated. And as I mentioned, this is in some way probably first logically, because if some evil come to us from other people, and this is from their free will, then how this is predestinated. But Maximus don't ask this question, so don't answer too. And the other problem is really, I mentioned that how we can understood all possible terrible atrocities in this world, if we imagine that God willingly preordinated things to be like that. I don't know, terrible torturing of children, for example. But Maximus on all this, as I understood, he said, don't go in this, and it is God providence and God predestinated everything. And I think that this is quite not so. His teaching about providence is not very good tested, to say.
I have one more, which deals with the hidden spiritual world that you mentioned.
Yes.
In connection with my paper, and I just found in my notes original text, and here spiritual is in fact intellectual world, because it reads "Odenim cryptomenos tonoiton panisete cosmos." So if spiritual is intellectual, then it leads us definitely back to Origen. And if it is Origen, then again, intellectual is not opposed to the material, because Origen says that everything is material apart from the Holy Trinity. So I think that might be some kind of, it's not solution, but a clue.
Yeah. But if you connect this with your lecture and with this beginningless of in deification, then we really have this problem. In my opinion, all these parts, and I will try to find all of them, when he talk cryptically, in the letters there is, I mentioned, but I didn't prepare now, some 4 or 5 places when he really briefly goes on some question, and they said it's enough about this question. like that he don't want to talk about. And we have on other places this very famous Timomenis Iopi, honorable silence about some things, and like this that there is some mystery and we cannot explain. So maybe if it's true that that he was accused for originalism in his young ages, maybe he was a little bit more cautious not to be later. But at the end, he was, as you know.
So what would Maximus say to Auschwitz?
I'm afraid that he, if this is how he understands God's providence and predestination, he will say that all of this is predestinated by God's will, but that we cannot understand the way how it is good at the end, or will be good at the end.
Vladimir has a question. I can see.
Yes, thank you. Well, that's very interesting because you have a very clear division. You made it in this dispute with Bishop Theodosius. Then kind of three elements. One is foreknowledge, prognosis, I think. Then you have providence, pronoia, and he's referring also to the Nicene term prorismoi, referring to logoi. Now, if we have this idea, when you mention that if logoi or logi works with being, creation, providence works with providential role, and then you have also in Ambigua 10 you have he's talking about judgment, you know, providence and judgment, this Evagrian term. Is anyway judgment in connection, in relation with prognosis? Because it works with judgment works with individual identities of the sameness of particular beings.
Yes, I didn't mention this famous topic of judgment because we don't have time. I didn't have time here. But as we know, this crisis for Maximus is not some moral but ontological issue, actually, where it is shown what was and what will be with creation. So yes, everything is connected, but this is the huge topic. The separate lecture this about pronoia and crisis, and very famous topic in Maximian studies. So I will not go further in this.
Thank you very much. Just a little question, more question, but tiny bit. You mentioned Philo of Alexandria's doctrine of logos. Did Maximus has direct access to Philo, or was it through some other text like maybe Origen?
I don't know. Some time ago, I talked about this with Tollefson, and he think that in some way he has, but in which way we can? I suppose that we for now we cannot be sure. Did he? Maybe. Well, Maximus read a lot of things, as we know. So it is possible that he read and Philo himself. But of course, it is possible that he find some of his ideas in other authors.
One more thing, not a question. I just have to apologize because I will not be able to participate in the second part because I have exams today. That's all.
That's a pity. Any more questions Or shall we close this session? I think this was a very good session. And it's a very good way to wind it up. Thank you too.
Almost like in Switzerland.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Then we'll reconvene on Zoom at 16 p.m. European time, East European time. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you later.